You mean to tell me you do this every day?
Ancel said, her brows high on her forehead as Celaena brushed rouge onto the girl's cheeks.
Sometimes twice a day,
Celaena said, and Ancel opened an eye. They were sitting on Celena's bed, a scattering of cosmetics between them. A small fraction of Celena's enormous collection back in Rifthold.
Besides being useful for my work, it's also fun.
Ancel opened the other eye.
Fun? Smearing all this gunk onto your face is fun.
Celaena set down her pot of rouge.
If you don't shut up, I'll draw a mustache on you.
Ansel's lips twitched, but she closed her eyes again, as Celaena raised a little container of bronze powder and dusted some onto her eyelids.
Well, it is my birthday, and Midsummer Eve,
Ancel said, her eyelashes fluttering beneath the tickle of Celena's delicate brush.
We so rarely get to have fun. I suppose I should look nice.
Ancel always looked nice. Better than nice, actually. But Celaena didn't need to tell her that.
At a minimum, at least you don't smell like horse droppings.
Ancel let out a breathy chuckle, the air warm on Celena's hands as they hovered near her face. She kept quiet while Celaena finished with the powder, then held still as she lined her eyes with kohl and darkened her lashes.
All right,
Celaena said, sitting back so she could see Ansel's face.
Open?
Ancel opened her eyes, and Celaena frowned.
What?
Ancel said. Celaena shook her head.
You're going to have to wash it all off.
Why?
Because you look better than I do!
Ancel pinched Celena's arm. Celaena pinched her back, laughter on her lips. But then, the single remaining week that Celaena had left loomed before her, brief and unforgiving, and her chest tightened at the thought of leaving. She hadn't even dared ask the master for her letter yet. But more than that, well, she'd never had a female friend, never really had any friends, and somehow, the thought of returning to Rifthold without Ancel was a tad unbearable. The Midsummer Eve festival was like nothing Celaena had ever experienced. She was expecting music and drinking and laughter, but instead, the assassins gathered in the largest of the fortress's courtyards, and all of them, including Ancel, were totally silent. The moon provided the only light, silhouetting the date trees, swaying along the courtyard walls. But the strangest part was the dancing. Even though there was no music, most of the people danced. Some of the dances foreign and strange, some of them familiar. Everyone was smiling, but aside from the rustle of clothing and the scrape of merry feet against stones, there was no sound. But there was wine, and she and Ancel found a table in the corner of the courtyard and fully indulged themselves. Though she loved parties, Celaena would have rather spent the night training with the master. With only 1 week left, she wanted to spend every waking moment working with him. But he'd insisted she go to the party, if only because he wanted to go to the party. The old man danced to a rhythm Celaena could not hear or make out, and looked more like someone's benevolent, clumsy grandfather than the master of some of the world's greatest assassins. She couldn't help but think of Arobin, who was all calculated grace and restrained aggression. Arobin who danced with a select few, and whose smile was razor sharp. Mikhail had dragged Ancel to the dancing, and she was grinning as she twisted and bobbed and bounced from partner to partner, all of the assassins now keeping the same silent beat. Ancel had experienced such horror, and yet she was still so carefree, so keenly alive. Mikhail caught her in his arms and dipped her low enough for Ansel's eyes to widen. Mikhail truly liked Ancel, that much was obvious. He always found excuses to touch her, always smiled at her, always looked at her as if she was the only person in the room. Celaena sloshed the wine around in her glass. If she were being honest, sometimes she thought Sam looked at her that way. But then he'd go and say something absurd, or try to undermine her, and she'd chide herself for even thinking about him. Her stomach tightened. What had Robin done to him that night? She should have inquired after him, but in the days afterwards, she'd been so busy, so wrapped up in her rage. She hadn't dared look for him, actually. But if a Robin had hurt Sam, the way he'd hurt her, if he'd hurt Sam worse than that... Celaena drained the rest of her wine. During the 2 days after she'd awoken from her beating, she used a good chunk of her savings to purchase her own apartment, away and well hidden from the Assassin's Keep. She hadn't told anyone, particularly because she was worried she might change her mind while she was away. But with each day here, with each lesson with the Master, she was more and more resolved to tell a Robin she was moving out. She was actually eager to see the look on his face. She still owed him money, of course. He'd seen to it that her debts would keep her with him for a while, but there was no rule that said she had to live with him. And if he ever laid a hand on her again... If a Robin ever laid a hand on her or Sam again, she'd see to it that he lost that hand. Actually, she'd see to it that he lost everything up to the elbow. Someone touched her on the shoulder, and Celaena looked up from her empty wine goblet to find Elias standing behind her. She hadn't seen much of him in the past few days, aside from at dinner, where he still glanced at her and gave her those lovely smiles. He offered his hand. Celena's face instantly warmed, and she shook her head, trying her best to convey a sense of not knowing these dances. Elias shrugged, his eyes bright. His hand remained extended. She bit her lip and glanced pointedly at his toes. Elias shrugged again, this time as if to suggest that his toes weren't all that valuable anyway. Celaena glanced at Mikhail and Ancel, spinning wildly to a beat only the two of them could hear. Elias raised his brows.
Live a little, Saradokin!
Ancel had said, that day they stole the horses. Why not live a little tonight, too? Celaena gave him a dramatic shrug and took his hand, tossing a wry smile his way. I suppose I can spare a dance or two, she wanted to say. Even though there was no music, Elias led her through the dances with ease. Each of his movements was sure and steady. It was hard to look away, not just from his face, but also from the contentment that radiated from him. And he looked back at her so intently that she had to wonder if he'd been watching her all these weeks, not only to protect his father. They danced until well after midnight. Wild dances that weren't at all like the waltzes she'd learnt in Rifthold. Even when she switched partners, Elias was always there, waiting for the next dance. It was almost as intoxicating as the oddity of dancing to no music. To hearing a collective silent rhythm, to letting the wind and the sighing sands outside the fortress provide the beat and the melody. It was lovely and strange. And as the hours passed, she often wondered if she'd strayed into a dream. When the moon was setting, Celaena found herself leaving the dance floor, doing her best to convey how exhausted she was. It wasn't a lie. Her feet hurt, and she hadn't had a proper night's rest in weeks and weeks. Elias tried pulling her back onto the dance floor for one last dance, but she nimbly slipped out of his grasp, grinning as she shook her head. Ancel and Mikhail were still dancing, holding each other closer than any other pair on the dance floor. Not wanting to interrupt her friend, Celaena left the hall, Elias in tow. She couldn't deny that her racing heartbeat wasn't just from the dancing, as they walked down the empty hall. Elias strode beside her, silent as ever, and she swallowed tightly. What would he say? That is, if he could speak, if he knew that Ardalin's assassin had never been kissed. She'd killed men, freed slaves, stolen horses, but she'd never kissed anyone. It was ridiculous, somehow. Something that she should have gotten out the way at some point. But she never found the right person. All too quickly, they were standing outside the door to her room. Celaena didn't touch the door handle, and tried to calm her breathing as she turned to face Elias. He was smiling. Maybe he didn't mean to kiss her. His room was, after all, just a few doors down. "Well," she said. After so many hours of silence, the word was jarringly loud. Her face burned. He stepped closer, and she tried not to flinch as he slipped a hand around her waist. It would be so simple to kiss him, she realized. His other hand slid against her neck, his thumb caressing her jaw as he gently tilted her head back. Her blood pounded through every inch of her. Her lips parted. But as Elias inclined his head, she went rigid and stepped back. He immediately withdrew, his brows crossed with concern. She wanted to seep into the stone and disappear. I'm sorry, she said thickly, trying not to look so mortified. I can't. I'm leaving in a week, and you live here, and I'm in Rifthold, so... She was babbling. She should stop. Actually, she should just stop talking. Forever. But if he sensed her mortification, he didn't show it. Instead, he bowed his head and squeezed her shoulder. Then he gave her one of those shrugs, which she interpreted to mean, "If only we didn't live thousands of miles apart. But can you blame me for trying?" With that, he strode the few feet to his room. He gave her a friendly wave before disappearing inside. Alone in the hallway, Celaena watched the shadows cast by the torches. It hadn't been the mere impossibility of a relationship with Elias that had made her pull away. No. It was the memory of Sam's face that had stopped her from kissing him. Ancel didn't come back to their room that night. And when she stumbled into the stables the following morning, still wearing her clothes from the party, Celaena could assume that she'd either spent the whole night dancing or with Mikhail. From the flush on Ancel's freckled cheeks, Celaena thought it might be both. Ancel took one look at the grin on Celaena's face and glowered.
Don't you even start.
Celaena shoveled a heap of manure into a nearby wagon. Later, she'd cart it to the gardens, where it would be used for fertilizer.
What?
Celaena said, grinning even wider.
I wasn't going to say anything.
Ancel snatched her shovel from where it leaned against the wooden wall, several pens down from where Cassida and Hisley now had their new homes.
Good. I got enough of it from the others while I was walking here.
Celaena leaned against her shovel in the open gate.
I'm sure Mikhail will get his fair share of teasing too.
Ancel straightened, her eyes surprisingly dark.
No, he won't. They'll congratulate him, just like they always do for a conquest well made.
She let out a long sigh from her nose.
But me, I'll get teased until I snap at them. It's always the same.
They continued their work in silence. After a moment, Celaena spoke.
Even though they tease you, you still want to be with Mikhail, right?
Ancel shrugged again, flinging dung into the pile she'd gathered in the wagon.
He's an amazing warrior. He's taught me far more than I would have learned without him. So they can tease me all they want, but at the end of the day, he's still the one giving me extra attention when we train.
That didn't sit well with Celaena, but she opted to keep her mouth shut.
Besides,
Ancel said, glancing sidelong at Celaena.
Not all of us can so easily convince the master to train us.
Celaena's stomach twisted a little. Was Ancel jealous of that?
I'm not entirely sure why he changed his mind. Oh?
Ancel said, sharper than Celaena had ever heard from her. It scared her, surprisingly.
The noble, clever, beautiful assassin from the north, the great Celaena Saradothin, has no idea why he'd want to train her. No idea that he might want to leave his mark on you two. To have a hand in shaping your glorious fate.
Celaena's throat tightened, and she cursed herself for feeling so hurt by the words. She didn't think the master felt that way at all, but she still hissed.
Yes, my glorious fate, shoveling dung in a barn. A worthy task for me.
Oh, but certainly a job worthy of a girl from the flatlands.
I didn't say that, and you know it,
Celaena said through her teeth.
Don't put words in my mouth.
Why not? I know you're thinking, and you know I'm telling the truth. I'm not good enough for the master to train me. I began seeing Mikhail to get extra attention during lessons, and I certainly don't have a notorious name to flaunt around.
Fine,
Celaena said.
Yes, most people in the kingdom know my name. Know to fear me.
Her temper rose with dizzying speed.
But you... You want to know the truth about you, Ancel. The truth is, even if you go home and get what you want, no one will give a damn if you take back your speck of territory. No one will even hear about it, because no one except for you will ever care!
She regretted the words the instant they left her mouth. Ancel's face went white with anger, and her lips trembled as she pressed them together. Ancel threw down her shovel. For a moment, Celaena thought she was going to attack, and even went as far as slightly bending her knees in anticipation for a fight. But Ancel stalked past her and said,
You're a spoiled, selfish bitch!
With that, she left Celaena to finish their morning chores.